Whose book? Whose car? Whose phone? Whose keys? Whose bag? Whose house? Whose shoes? Whose idea? Whose turn? Whose child?
Whose coat? Whose ticket? Whose money? Whose drink? Whose seat? Whose glasses? Whose laptop? Whose umbrella? Whose passport? Whose suitcase?
Whom to call? Whom did see? Whom for you? Whom with her? Whom to ask? Whom did meet? Whom from him? Whom to tell? Whom about me? Whom for us?
Whom not to call? Whom didn't you see? Whom not to ask? Whom not to tell? Whom didn't they meet? Whom not to trust? Whom didn't she invite? Whom not to hire? Whom didn't we contact? Whom not to blame? Who loves you? Who knows this? Who came here? Who saw that? Who wants tea? Who helped you? Who called me? Who wrote this? Who broke it? Who said that?
Who doesn't know? Who didn't come? Who hasn't eaten? Who won't help? Who didn't see? Who doesn't care? Who hasn't heard? Who didn't go? Who won't come? Who doesn't want?
How isn't ready? How didn't come? How won't start? How doesn't know? How hasn't arrived? How didn't work? How won't open? How doesn't fit? How hasn't changed? How didn't happen?
How are you? How is it? How did go? How does work? How came here? How knows that? How found it? How made this? How solved it? How learned that?
What doesn't work? What didn't arrive? What won't happen? What hasn't changed? What don't you like? What didn't she say? What doesn't matter? What won't they eat? What hasn't arrived? What don't we know?
What is this? What do you? What did say? What wants she? What makes happy? What came first? What does mean? What happened now? What brought you? What changed today?
When isn't ready? When didn't arrive? When won't begin? When doesn't open? When hasn't come? When didn't call? When won't finish? When doesn't close? When hasn't left? When didn't answer?
When is it? When did come? When will start? When does leave? When arrived she? When called you? When saw him? When told her? When met them? When finished work?
Where isn't she? Where didn't go? Where doesn't live? Where aren't they? Where hasn't been? Where won't stay? Where didn't put? Where doesn't work? Where haven't seen? Where won't find?
Where is she? Where do you? Where did go? Where lives he? Where are they? Where put it? Where found you? Where does work? Where stayed she? Where bought that?
Which isn't ready? Which didn't arrive? Which won't fit? Which doesn't match? Which hasn't changed? Which didn't work? Which won't open? Which doesn't belong? Which hasn't come? Which didn't arrive?
Which is yours? Which did choose? Which came first? Which wants this? Which fits best? Which tastes better? Which looks nicer? Which works well? Which belongs to? Which feels right?
Why isn't ready? Why didn't come? Why won't stay? Why doesn't work? Why hasn't called? Why didn't tell? Why won't answer? Why doesn't help? Why hasn't arrived? Why didn't wait?
Why is that? Why did go? Why came late? Why said that? Why loves me? Why left early? Why called her? Why bought this? Why asked him? Why chose this?